The candlelight flickers softly in a stone chamber, the sort of chamber you might imagine in an old medieval castle. The walls are thick, the air faintly cool, and the quiet rhythm of life moves slowly, as though centuries pass like hours. Imagine yourself here, resting among shadows, hearing only the hushed voices of history, told in a way that is gentle, unhurried, and steady. Tonight, as you prepare to drift into sleep, we will wander through the lives of kings, those rulers often remembered not for greatness, but for their flaws, for their follies, for their troubled reigns. Yet even the most terrible kings, when viewed through the softened lens of time, can become figures of quiet contemplation, reminders of human imperfection, set against the vast backdrop of medieval life. The Middle Ages, stretching across centuries, was an age of stone castles, of flickering torches along quiet corridors, of bells echoing across valleys at dawn. It was a time where kings ruled with authority that seemed absolute, yet they too were bound by circumstance, by weakness, and by choices that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. In speaking of terrible kings, one might expect tales of cruelty and hardship, but for tonight, let us move through these stories like one moves through a quiet gallery, gazing upon old paintings, lingering not on horror, but on detail, on texture, on the gentle unfolding of lives that have long since ended. To set the stage, let us begin with the atmosphere of the medieval court. A king's hall was not always filled with splendor. In the dim glow of tallow candles, smoke often hung heavy in the rafters. The air carried the mingling scents of roasted meat, burning wood, and damp stone. Servants padded softly across worn rushes scattered on the floor. The walls, often hung with tapestries, were not simply decoration, but insulation against the cold. This was the world in which kings sat upon their thrones, sometimes noble, sometimes wise, but at other times foolish, reckless, or consumed by weakness. One such king, often spoken of when recalling the troubled rulers of England, was King John. His name still lingers as a symbol of poor kingship, yet when described softly, his story becomes a quiet meditation on responsibility, on the burdens of leadership, and on the way history remembers those who falter. King John came to the throne in the year 1199, inheriting a kingdom that was vast and powerful, but where his brother, Richard the Lionheart, had embodied the image of the heroic crusader, John found himself struggling. His rule was marked by disputes with barons, quarrels with the church, and the loss of lands in France. Yet beyond the battles and the politics, one might imagine him sitting alone in a candlelit chamber, poring over scrolls of accounts, for John was known to be meticulous with details. His reputation was not only for cruelty, but also for his relentless concern with the minutiae of government. A man who counted coins and fretted over debts. When listening for sleep, one might imagine John not as a tyrant shouting across a hall, but as a weary figure hunched over parchment, quill in hand, muttering softly to himself as the hours slipped away. The cold stone walls around him offered no comfort. The flicker of firelight threw restless shadows. Outside, the rain might have pattered against the narrow windows. The King of England, for all his power, sat burdened with thoughts that refused to ease. Perhaps it is this sense of unease that made his reign so troubled, for a ruler who cannot find peace within himself may seldom bring peace to his realm. John's legacy, of course, is forever tied to the Magna Carta, a document forced upon him by his barons in 1215. In modern times, it is remembered as a foundation of liberty, yet in John's own day, it was more a list of complaints and constraints. Imagine the scene: a meadow at Runnymede, the River Thames flowing gently beside it, the banners of barons stirring in the breeze. The king's pavilion stood nearby, its fabric walls shifting slightly with the summer wind. Horses stamped their hooves, restless. And there, amid the hush of tense negotiation, John affixed his seal to the parchment that would limit his power. It was not a moment of triumph for him, but a quiet humiliation. One can almost hear the sound of wax being pressed, the scratch of quills, and the distant call of birds along the riverbank. And yet, in the way that sleep-soft storytelling reshapes the harshness of history, John's story becomes less about failure and more about fragility. He was not the only ruler to falter. Across medieval Europe, there were kings who stumbled in their duties, who became remembered not for noble deeds, but for mistakes, for cruelty, or for their inability to guide their kingdoms through troubled waters. Let us drift further, across the Channel to France. Here, in the 14th century, there reigned a king often remembered as unwise Charles VI. Known to history as Charles the Mad, he ascended the throne young, inheriting a realm rich and proud. But as years passed, shadows grew within his mind. At times, he believed himself made of glass, fearing that he would shatter if touched. At other times, he wandered the halls in confusion, unable to recognize those around him. To imagine such a king is to imagine a court wrapped in unease, courtiers speaking in hushed tones, the air heavy with uncertainty. Yet even here, let us soften the image. Rather than seeing Charles as terrifying, one might picture him gently, as a figure lost within himself, moving through the gilded halls like a dreamer wandering in mist. The chandeliers above glowed softly, tapestries shifted faintly in the breeze, and the king's eyes drifted away from those who sought his attention. His reign, marked by instability, would trouble France deeply, especially during the 100 Years' War. But in this calm telling, Charles becomes a symbol not of horror, but of the delicate nature of the human mind. Even beneath a crown of gold beyond the courts of France and England, one can journey further still. To the east, in the wide lands of Hungary, Władysław II sat upon the throne in the late 15th century. He was called Władysław the Incompetent by some of his subjects, for he was known to agree too easily with others, earning him the nickname Dobbs, or all right, for he seemed to say it constantly. Yet what a peaceful image that is, when softened for sleep. A king who nodded along, who did not resist, who let decisions wash over him like water flowing past stones in a stream. Perhaps his kingdom suffered for it, but in the stillness of night, his figure becomes almost serene, a man content to yield, a monarch who, in his passivity, allowed history to move around him. It is important to remember that even the so-called terrible kings lived in worlds textured with daily life. Castles bustled with servants tending to fires, with cooks stirring pots of thick stews, with grooms tending horses in straw-filled stables. The clatter of wooden cups on long tables echoed through stone halls. Children played in courtyards, their laughter carrying upward to the battlements. Even under rulers who struggled or failed, life carried on in its steady rhythm. Farmers still rose at dawn to work the fields. Monks still sang their prayers in candlelit choirs. Seasons turned, winters brought snow upon rooftops, and spring sent green shoots rising in meadows. And so, when we speak of kings remembered as terrible, let us also remember the world around them, the lives of countless ordinary people, who lived through their reigns not in grand battles or political disputes, but in the quiet routines of tending hearth and home. These lives, more than any king's failings, made up the true fabric of medieval history. Drifting further into this calm narrative, let us linger again on the atmosphere of medieval nights. Imagine a great hall after a feast, the rushes on the floor littered with fragments of bread, the fire in the hearth burning low. The echoes of laughter and music have faded. Only a few candles remain lit, their wax dripping slowly. In some corner, a dog lies curled, snoring faintly, and somewhere above, in a chamber hung with thick curtains, a king lies awake, burdened by thoughts. Perhaps he is a king like John, counting debts in his mind. Perhaps he is a king like Charles, lost within troubled thought. Or perhaps he is one of many others, remembered now not for glory, but for their struggles. The night deepens, the world grows quieter, and we, in listening, wander deeper into the soft corridors of history, where shadows lengthen and the past becomes a gentle companion. The fire in the great hall has burned low, and the soft glow of embers casts a dim red light across the stone hearth. One can imagine the long shadows stretching along the walls, tapestries swaying slightly in the draught that slips through narrow windows. In these hushed hours, history feels less like a record of battles and decrees, and more like a quiet presence, a whisper of stories that linger long after the kings themselves have passed away. As we drift deeper into the tapestry of medieval life, let us turn our thoughts toward another king whose reign has been remembered as troubled, though in the softened tones of memory, he appears more as a weary figure than a monster. In England, before the rise of John, there was another king whose name is spoken with pity, Tethelard, known to history as Tethelard the Unready. His epithet, though harsh, was not meant to say he was unprepared, but rather that he was ill-advised, poorly counseled. Imagine for a moment a young king, ascending the throne in the late 10th century, his childhood overshadowed by the violent death of his half-brother. The weight of the crown was heavy, yet he had little guidance to steady him. His reign was marked by invasions from the Danes, fierce seafarers who raided the English coasts. But rather than picture violent raids, let us soften the image. Imagine instead the anxious court of Thelard, where news of another landing reached the king by messenger. A weary rider, mud splattered on his boots, bowed low before the throne, delivering word that the north coast had once again been struck. The hall was filled, not with shouting, but with heavy sighs. Thelard, young still, might have rubbed his brow, listening in silence as advisers offered conflicting counsel. Should he raise armies? Should he pay tribute? The choices weighed upon him like stones in a pouch. He often chose to pay the invaders, sending forth chests of silver, a practice called danegeld. It is easy to condemn such decisions, but in the hush of centuries later, one might picture Thelard not as a coward, but as a man simply overwhelmed. In a candlelit chamber, with the rain drumming gently against wooden shutters, he may have sat with scribes, counting coins, hoping that payment would spare his people bloodshed. The silver gleamed faintly in torchlight, a symbol of both wealth and desperation. Outside, farmers still worked their fields, children played in village lanes, and life went on in rhythm with the seasons. Lethrid's reign may have faltered, but the world around him was steady in its small routines. History often remembers him unkindly, but in the quiet of this telling, his story becomes one of human frailty, of a man trying and failing, yet always burdened with the hope of peace. When one considers kings in this way, their legacies shift from harsh judgment to gentle meditation on how difficult it is to lead when the world seems beyond control. From England, let us drift gently to another court, this time in the heart of France, where another troubled monarch left his mark upon history. King John II of France, who reigned in the mid-14th century, found himself caught in the turmoil of the 100 Years' War. His reign was shadowed by defeat, most notably at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where he was captured by the English. One can imagine the confusion of that day. Yet for our purposes, let us not picture the clash of steel or the cries of men, but rather the quiet aftermath. Picture John seated in a tent beneath a pale sky, the canvas walls stirring faintly in the wind. His armor has been set aside, and he sits in plain garments, a prisoner though still a king. Outside, English guards move quietly, their voices low. Within, John gazes downward, perhaps tracing patterns in the dirt with a finger, reflecting on what had unfolded. For him, the weight of defeat was immense, yet in this softened telling, we see not disgrace, but stillness, the stillness of a man pausing in the flow of events, as though the world itself had slowed. He was taken to England, where he lived in comfortable captivity. Imagine his days there, waking to the sound of distant bells in London, looking out across gardens and hearing the muted sounds of life in a foreign land. Though a king in chains, his existence in captivity had its rhythms, meals served on wooden trays, letters exchanged with his court in France, and evenings where candlelight illuminated the faces of attendants who remained loyal to him. Defeat and capture, when softened, become not harsh failures, but quiet chapters, part of the long drift of time. In this way, John II joins the gallery of kings remembered as flawed, yet softened by the passage of centuries. He reminds us that even the mightiest can be humbled, and yet life continues in its steady flow, no matter the turns of fortune. Another figure worth our calm attention is Henry VI of England, whose reign in the 15th century was marked by instability and weakness. Unlike his warrior father, Henry V, who triumphed at Agincourt, Henry VI was gentle, devout, and ill-suited to the harsh demands of kingship. His court was one of quiet piety, more monastic than martial. He loved prayer and learning, and he founded institutions of education that would endure. But as king, he struggled. His mind was fragile, often retreating into silence, and during these times others ruled in his name. Picture Henry seated in a simple chair, his hands folded in his lap, eyes unfocused. Around him, courtiers whisper, uncertain. The fire crackles softly, the smell of wax drifting from tall candles, the hush broken only by the distant toll of a bell from some chapel beyond the palace walls. Henry himself is serene, lost in thought or in prayer, while the kingdom outside wrestles with turmoil. In the Wars of the Roses, he became a pawn in the struggles of powerful nobles, his reign collapsing into conflict. But in our calm reflection, he is not a figure of failure so much as a gentle soul misplaced upon a throne. The fragility of Henry VI reminds us that power does not always bring strength. Even in the grandest halls, there can be silence, and even upon a throne there can be stillness of mind. His story, when told for sleep, becomes not a tale of political chaos, but of a quiet king whose heart leaned toward peace in a world of war. And now let us drift south, to the kingdoms of Iberia, where another monarch left a complicated legacy. Peter of Castile, known as Peter the Cruel by some, or Peter the Just by others, reigned in the 14th century. His rule was marked by conflict, both with nobles and with neighboring realms. Yet, as with all such figures, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. To his enemies, he was cruel. To his supporters, he was fair. One might imagine Peter not in the heat of battle, but in the shaded courtyards of Castilian palaces. The air is warm, scented with orange blossoms. Water trickles softly in fountains, echoing against tiled walls. The king sits beneath an archway, his face calm, while advisors debate around him. He listens, eyes half closed against the sunlight, the weight of decision pressing upon him. The name Cruel lingers in history, but perhaps in moments like these, he was no more than a man surrounded by pressures he could not escape. And so, in these wanderings through medieval courts, we see a pattern. Kings remembered as terrible were not always monsters. Sometimes they were weak, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes caught in circumstances beyond their control. Their failings became magnified in chronicles, yet when told slowly, gently, they emerged as figures almost dreamlike human beings, no more, no less, beyond the kings themselves. The texture of their worlds continues to soothe, the sound of footsteps echoing in cloisters, the flutter of banners in a summer breeze, the crackle of torches in a long, cold corridor. These details remind us that history is not made only of grand deeds, but of countless small moments, lived by kings and commoners alike. That as night deepens, let us leave these kings for now, and listen instead to the soft rhythms of medieval life. Picture a village at dusk, smoke curling from the thatched roofs of cottages, children chasing each other before being called inside. A shepherd gathers his flock, the bells on the animals chiming faintly. The scent of wood smoke and stew drifts through the air. Above, the stars appear slowly, one by one, the same stars that kings and peasants alike would have gazed upon. In such moments, the failures of rulers fade, and what remains is the constancy of life itself. And so ends this portion of our journey, not with judgment, but with calm reflection. The kings we call terrible were also human, wrapped in the same night air, touched by the same flicker of flame, bound to the same turning seasons as all who lived in their time. The night deepens, and the castle grows quieter still. Only the faint creak of beams and the sigh of wind through narrow slits in the stone remind us that the world beyond the hall continues to move. Within, the fire burns lower, its last embers glowing like stars fallen to earth. Such moments of silence are timeless. They might have been felt in any century, by any king, or by the simplest of villagers. And it is in this atmosphere of stillness that we return once more to those rulers remembered, not for their triumphs, but for their failings, softened now into the gentle tapestry of history. Let us turn now to Edward II of England, a king whose reign in the early 14th century has often been judged harshly. He was the son of Edward I, the formidable hammer of the Scots, yet Edward II was nothing like his father. Where the elder Edward was stern, commanding, and relentless in battle, the younger Edward was fond of simpler pleasures. He enjoyed music, company, and even laboring with common folk, rowing boats, digging ditches, and tending to gardens. These were not traits celebrated by the nobles of his time, who expected their king to embody martial strength and stern authority. Picture him, then, not as a failed monarch in the harsh light of chroniclers, but as a man of gentler tastes, perhaps in the gardens of a royal palace, kneeling in the soil with dirt upon his hands, feeling the coolness of earth as he planted herbs. Around him, the air would have been fragrant with rosemary, sage, and thyme, while bees hummed lazily among blossoms. In the distance, servants whispered, uneasy with their king's habits. But for Edward, these small labors may have brought peace. Yet kingship is not made for gentleness alone. His reliance on favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, stirred anger among the nobles, who felt their influence threatened. One can imagine the tension of those years, the soft clink of goblets at feasts, the sharp glances exchanged across the table, the undercurrent of resentment that no music or laughter could disguise. Edward himself, perhaps oblivious or perhaps unwilling to confront the storm, might have looked instead toward the candlelight, seeking comfort in companionship rather than politics. His reign eventually collapsed into rebellion, and he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. But in the softened telling of Sleep, Edward II becomes not a figure of disgrace, but of misplacement, a man more suited to the life of a gardener or minstrel than to the burdens of a crown. His failings remind us that power often demands qualities not found in every heart, and that not every soul destined for kingship is fashioned for it. From England, let us move across the waters to Scotland, where another king, John Balliol, is remembered as weak. Chosen in the late 13th century as King of Scots, his reign was overshadowed by the influence of Edward I of England, who sought to dominate Scotland. John was caught in the difficult position of being a king in name, but in practice, bound by stronger forces around him. Chroniclers called him Tomb Tabard, the empty coat, a title suggesting hollowness. But let us reimagine him, not as hollow, but as a quiet figure weighed down by circumstance. In the great hall of Scone, perhaps, he sat upon a throne with the stone of destiny beneath him, the banners of Scotland fluttering faintly in the draught. Nobles stood around him, their voices loud with demands. John listened, his face pale, his hands gripping the carved arms of the throne. The hall smelled of rushes and wax, the echoes of boots against stone filling the air. To the nobles, he seemed hesitant, but perhaps within his own mind he simply wished for stillness, for the clamor to fade. His reign ended in humiliation, stripped of kingship by Edward and sent into exile. Yet, in our gentle reflection, he becomes a symbol of how power can be an ill-fitting garment, heavy on the shoulders of those not fashioned for it. Across the seas, in the kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, too, there were rulers whose reigns faltered. Consider Eric of Pomerania, king in the early 15th century, ruling over the Kalmar Union. He inherited vast lands, yet his rule was marked by discontent and rebellion. Still, one might picture him not as a tyrant, but as a solitary figure gazing out over the Baltic Sea from the windows of a castle tower. The waters stretched endlessly, grey and calm beneath a cloudy sky. Ships drifted upon the horizon, sails billowing faintly. Eric's thoughts were his own, heavy with the burden of holding together a union that strained against him. His reign ended in deposition, yet in this softened telling, the image of a lonely king by the sea remains more poignant than pitiful. If we drift further east, we may rest our gaze upon Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, remembered as indolent, preferring leisure to governance. His reign in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was marked by unrest, as he struggled to assert control over nobles and clergy. Yet, rather than picture him as lazy, let us imagine him in his hunting lodge, surrounded by the deep forests of Bohemia. The air was cool and fragrant with pine, the rustle of leaves accompanying the distant call of stags. Wenceslas reclined in a wooden chair, a goblet of wine beside him, his hounds stretched lazily at his feet. He may have seemed idle to chroniclers, but in this moment, he is a man content in the quiet company of nature and loyal animals, far from the weight of crowns and councils. History calls such kings terrible, but when told with softness, they appear as figures caught between human inclination and royal duty. Their failings, so sharply criticized, become softened reminders that kings were not so different from ordinary men, except that their errors were magnified by crowns of gold. Meanwhile, the daily life of the people around them unfolded steadily, undisturbed by court intrigue. In a medieval town, the marketplace bustled each morning as stalls were set up. Cloth was hung in folds of bright color, baskets of apples and onions placed carefully on wooden boards. The smell of fresh bread drifted through narrow lanes, mingling with the scent of herbs from the apothecary's shop. Children darted through crowds, weaving between merchants calling out their wares. The murmur of voices rose like a gentle wave, punctuated by the bleating of goats or the clatter of a wheel upon cobblestones. Even under kings remembered as terrible, such scenes played out endlessly. Farmers still bartered for seed, bakers still kneaded dough before dawn, and smiths hammered iron in sparks of fire. These rhythms remind us that life's steadiness outlasts the turbulence of rulers. Returning to the courts, let us pause upon another English monarch, Richard II. Crowned as a boy, he grew into a king who cherished ceremony and grandeur, but who struggled to govern wisely. He loved beauty, fine clothing, and elaborate rituals, surrounding himself with art and splendor. One might imagine him in Westminster Hall, where golden light poured through stained glass, catching upon hangings of scarlet and gold. The hall echoed with the sound of his steps, soft upon the rushes, as he admired the display around him. Yet, beyond this love of pageantry, his rule faltered. As he alienated nobles and relied heavily on favorites, his downfall came in deposition, replaced by Henry IV. Yet in our sleep-soft telling, Richard becomes not a figure of tyranny, but a dreamer, perhaps more poet than ruler, who found solace in beauty, but faltered in the harsher demands of kingship. One might imagine him gazing out at the Thames, its surface rippling in twilight, his thoughts wandering to things beyond the realm of power. And so, through Edward II, John Balliol, Eric of Pomerania, Wenceslas of Bohemia, and Richard II, we see kings remembered as terrible, but softened now into dreamlike figures. Their halls, their gardens, their forests, their rivers all remain in memory, filled with the quiet details of medieval life. As the night grows deeper still, let us rest upon these images. The hum of bees in Edward's garden, the banners stirring in Balliol's hall, the waves stretching before Eric's tower, the hounds of Wenceslas asleep by the hearth, and the stained glass casting colours upon Richard's robes. These images linger softly, like drifting clouds across the moon. The fire burns low once more, and our journey through history continues, steady and calm, as the past unfolds not in harsh judgment, but in quiet reflection. The castle lies wrapped in silence, the heavy wooden doors are barred, the fires in the kitchens have burned down to faint glows, and the echo of footsteps has long since faded. In such quiet time itself seems to stretch, carrying us gently forward, deeper into the centuries, where more kings, remembered for failings or misfortunes, appear before us not as tyrants to be feared, but as shadowed figures softened by the passing of years. Let us now drift to France once more, and to the figure of Louis X, known as Louis the Quarrelsome. His reign at the dawn of the 14th century was short, only a couple of years, and filled with disputes both within the royal household and beyond. Yet when softened for sleep, his reign becomes less a tale of discord and more a gentle reflection on the fragility of life. Imagine him seated in a chamber of the Palais de la Cite in Paris. The Seine flows quietly beyond, carrying barges laden with timber and stone. In the hall, tapestries stir faintly, woven with scenes of hunts and battles. Louis leans forward on his chair, brows furrowed, listening as advisers press their cases. His eyes flicker with restlessness, the quarrels that earned his name consuming him even in small matters. And yet, beyond the walls of the palace, life continued, as ever the call of vendors in the market, the laughter of children at play, the solemn chants of monks in the great churches. Louis himself would not reign long, passing suddenly, leaving behind questions of succession. In this way, his story lingers as a brief flicker of unease within the long sweep of French history, a reminder of how quickly crowns may pass from one head to another. From France we may cross once more to the northern kingdoms, to Denmark, where Christian II reigned in the early 16th century. His rule is often remembered harshly, especially for the event called the Stockholm bloodbath, a moment of execution and political strife. Yet in the softened telling of night, we need not dwell upon such sharpness. Instead, imagine Christian not in that moment of turmoil, but later, when his reign had faltered and he was imprisoned. Picture him in the fortress of Sunderborg, walking slowly across the wooden planks of his chamber, the Baltic winds whispering faintly through cracks in the walls. The sea stretched endlessly beyond, grey and still, dotted with gulls. He lived there in confinement for years, a king reduced to stillness, passing his days in reflection. In such quiet, his story becomes not one of cruelty, but of solitude, of a man bound by stone walls, yet accompanied always by the rhythm of the sea. Now let us wander back to England, to the reign of Stephen, a king whose time on the throne in the 12th century was troubled by civil war. His reign is remembered as the Anarchy, a time when rival claimants tore the land with conflict. But here, in the gentle retelling for sleep, we may imagine Stephen not amid clashing armies, but in the quiet moments between, perhaps in the cloisters of a monastery where he sought counsel. The air cool with incense, the soft chant of monks drifting through arched windows. Stephen walked slowly, his hand trailing along the carved stone, his thoughts heavy. Outside, fields rippled with wind, cattle grazed in meadows, and rivers flowed on, indifferent to the disputes of kings. His reign may have been chaotic, yet he, too, was a man caught in the tide of circumstance, seeking moments of stillness wherever they could be found. Beyond England, in the far corners of Europe, Other kings too carried the weight of troubled reigns. Consider Ladislas the Posthumous of Hungary and Bohemia. Born after his father's death, he came to the throne as a child, his reign overshadowed by regents and nobles who vied for control. To imagine his childhood is to imagine long stone corridors where a boy in royal robes walked under the watchful eyes of guardians. He may have paused at windows, gazing out at the forests stretching into mist, dreaming of freedom beyond the palace walls. His life was brief, his reign short, and he died young, leaving behind little but a whisper in history. Yet even in that whisper, there is a kind of calm beauty, the fleeting presence of a young king whose crown was more burden than blessing. From Hungary, let us drift southward to the warm lands of Naples, where Joanna II reigned in the 15th century. Though not a king but a queen, her reign too was troubled, filled with intrigue and quarrels among her nobles. Yet, let us imagine her not in the clamor of politics, but in the shaded courtyards of a Neapolitan palace. The air was scented with lemon and jasmine. Fountains murmured softly, and sunlight played upon marble columns. Joanna reclined in the cool shade, listening to the hum of cicadas, her thoughts drifting as lightly as the breeze. Whatever the turmoil of her reign, in moments like these, she was simply a woman at rest, her story softened into calm reflection. We may linger now not upon individuals, but upon the rhythms of courtly life that framed them all. A medieval court was a place of contrasts. The grandeur of feasts and ceremonies, balanced by the simplicity of daily routines. In the kitchens, vast cauldrons of stew simmered, tended by cooks stirring with wooden paddles. Spices precious and rare were ground with pestles, releasing their fragrance into the air. Servants hurried with trenchers of bread, with flagons of ale, with platters of roasted fowl. The hall above would fill with music, the soft strum of lutes, the lilting of voices raised in song. Yet, as the night wore on, the clamor faded, and only the soft scrape of benches, the low murmur of tired voices, remained. In such a world, kings and queens, whether remembered as terrible or beloved, were always surrounded by these rhythms. Their reigns might falter, their decisions might be flawed, yet life beneath them flowed on, steady and unbroken. Consider now another figure, Charles II of Navarre, often called Charles the Bad. His reign in the 14th century was marked by shifting alliances and constant intrigue. Chroniclers judged him harshly, yet let us soften him here. Imagine Charles walking through the narrow streets of Pamplona at dusk, cloaked and hooded, the cobblestones echoing faintly beneath his steps. Lamps glowed in windows, the smell of bread and wood smoke filled the air, and the hum of evening prayers drifted from a nearby church. In this softened scene, Charles becomes not the bad, but simply a man of his time, walking through his city as night gathered around him. From Navarre, we may return once more to England, to the reign of Harold Godwin's. Though remembered less as terrible and more as tragic, he ruled only briefly before the Norman conquest, his name overshadowed by the Battle of Hastings. Yet beyond the clash of arms, imagine Harold in the calm of the English countryside. Days before that fateful moment, he might have walked through fields golden with late summer, hearing the rustle of grain and the calls of birds overhead. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across the land he loved. Whatever turmoil awaited, in that moment he was simply a man, breathing the stillness of evening, as countless others have done across the centuries. As the night deepens, we see that the so-called terrible kings, and even the tragic ones, share a common thread. They were men and women bound by time, by circumstance, by the same need for rest, for food, for warmth, for the companionship of others. Their crowns may have set them apart, but the rhythm of life bound them together with all their subjects. Imagine once more a great hall at night. The rushes upon the floor are scattered, the fire low, the banners above swaying gently. A single candle flickers on a high table, its flame bending in the draught, and there, in that vast emptiness, a king sits alone, lost in thought. His name may be remembered harshly, his reign judged a failure, but in that still moment he is simply contemplative, fragile, and we, centuries later, drift with him, our own thoughts softened by the hush of history. The night lingers, and the long corridors of history stretch before us, lit by faint lamps of memory. We walk slowly, as though through a cloister where each step echoes softly against stone. Another king awaits us now, his story framed not in thunder and noise, but in the quiet pulse of daily life long ago. Let us return to France, to the figure of Charles VI, Remembered by history as Charles the Mad, his reign in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was overshadowed by periods of mental illness, and the kingdom was often governed by regents in his stead. Yet in this softened telling, we need not focus on his afflictions, but rather on the gentle rhythms of his days, on the stillness that surrounded him during moments of quietude. Imagine Charles wandering slowly through the gardens of the Hotel St. Paul in Paris. The pathways are lined with roses, their petals soft and fragrant. Bees move lazily among the blossoms, and the air hums with summer warmth. Attendants follow at a respectful distance, but for a time, Charles is left in solitude, his hand brushing against lavender stems, releasing their calming scent. He pauses at a fountain where water falls steadily, the sound like a lullaby against stone. Here, the troubled king is at rest, a man bound to earth by the simple beauty of flowers, the gentle rhythm of flowing water, the warmth of sunlight filtering through leaves. In those quiet moments, the grandeur of monarchy slips away. He becomes less the mad king of chronicles and more a solitary soul, fragile and human, seeking comfort in the soft touch of nature. From France we may drift once more to England, to the reign of John, often called Bad King John. Chroniclers painted him as greedy and faithless, and his reign saw rebellion that ended in the sealing of Magna Carta. But here, let us soften the edges of his tale. Picture John not in battle or council, but seated in the great kitchens of Windsor Castle late at night. The hearth burns low, casting a golden glow upon rough stone walls. A wooden table is laden with bread, cheese, and ale, simple fare set aside by cooks who have long since retired. John sits alone, tearing a piece of bread and dipping it into broth, his thoughts heavy yet softened by the hush of midnight. Outside, owls call in the forest, and the River Thames moves quietly under the moonlight. His name may be carried with reproach, but in this softened scene he is but a weary man, eating slowly in silence. Warmed by firelight and solitude, it is often in these imagined moments of stillness that the terrors of reputation melt away, leaving only the quiet hum of humanity. Now, let us cross to the eastern realms, to Hungary once again, and to Bela too. Remembered as Bela the Blind, ascending the throne in the 12th century, his reign was shaped by the counsel of his queen, Helena. Though his disability was the mark most noted by historians, it did not prevent him from ruling, and in the softened vision of night, his life takes on a gentle quality. Imagine Bela seated in a hall lit by hundreds of candles, their flames flickering like stars. He listens closely to the words of his advisors, his head tilted slightly as he absorbs their counsel. He cannot see the play of light across stone, but he can hear the rustle of garments, the faint creak of benches, the murmur of voices as decisions are shaped. When the hall empties, and only silence remains, Helena approaches quietly, placing her hand in his. Together they sit in the hush, the weight of the crown balanced by the comfort of shared presence. His story becomes not one of weakness, but of companionship, of governance supported by trust and love. From Hungary we may travel northward, into the Scandinavian twilight, to the figure of Eric XIV of Sweden in the 16th century. His reign was marked by instability and suspicion, yet in the quiet hours we may imagine a different side. Picture Eric walking slowly through the pine forests near Uppsala, the air crisp with resin, and the calls of birds overhead. He pauses to run his hand along the bark of a tree, breathing in deeply, the forest grounding him. Far from courts and councils, far from suspicion, he is simply a man among trees, the scent of earth and pine mingling with the cool air, bringing him a measure of peace. It is in such imagined walks that the burdens of rule soften, dissolving into the calm vastness of nature. Beyond Sweden, across the breadth of Europe, many rulers remembered harshly may be found, yet to drift among them is not to condemn, but to listen gently to the rhythms of their lives. Let us pause now with Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, whose reign in the 14th century was clouded by conflict and neglect. Yet imagine him in the soft glow of a Prague evening, seated by a window overlooking the Vltava river. The water reflects lanterns, shimmering with golden light. A lute is played faintly in the hall below, and the air carries the scent of roasted meat and honeyed wine. For a time, the troubles of governance fade, and he listens simply to music, the strains carrying him into stillness. As night deepens, one begins to see a pattern among these rulers. Chroniclers painted them with harsh strokes, terrible, mad, weak, cruel. Yet when softened through the lens of time, their stories reveal a shared humanity, Each of them ate, drank, sat in silence, sought companionship, or found solace in the natural world. Let us turn now to Alfonso XI of Castile, remembered for harsh campaigns, yet also for moments of stillness. Imagine him at the edge of a camp, the night sky above brilliant with stars, the campfires burn low, soldiers sleep upon the ground, and only the murmur of distant conversation drifts through the stillness. Alfonso stands alone, gazing upward, the vastness of the heavens reminding him of his own smallness. The stars shine upon him as they shine upon peasants and nobles alike, indifferent to crowns or titles. Or consider James II of Scotland, whose reign in the 15th century was marked by fiery temper. Chroniclers wrote of passion and violence, but in our softened tale we may imagine him instead walking along the banks of the river Forth, the evening breeze rippling the surface of the water. Children play in the distance, their laughter carried faintly. James pauses to watch, the hard lines of his face easing, if only for a moment. In that instant, the sternness of reputation dissolves into something gentler, more ordinary, more human. And so we see, time and again, that the terribleness ascribed by history is not the full story. It is but one layer, drawn sharply in ink by those who recorded events. Beneath it lies another story, the quiet, the still, the human. Now imagine with me the chambers of a medieval monastery at night. The bells have rung, the monks have retired, and the air is thick with silence. Only the faint dripping of water in a cloister fountain remains, steady and soothing. Into this silence step the kings of history, not as rulers but as weary souls. They set aside their crowns, their cloaks, their burdens, and sit upon the wooden benches. Their eyes close, their shoulders relax, and for the first time they, too, rest. Perhaps this is the truest way to see them, not as terrible figures looming large, but as fragile men, shaped by time, by fear, by love, by mistakes, seeking rest as all must do. And in that realization, the harshness of their legacy softens into quiet understanding. The night stretches on, and we walk slowly, calmly, deeper into history, carrying with us the softened stories of kings once feared, now remembered in gentleness. The night deepens, and the soft glow of memory continues to guide us. Each step carries us deeper into the medieval past, into the halls of rulers whose names echo harshly in chronicles, yet whose humanity, when viewed through the slow rhythm of sleep, is gentle and familiar. Let us wander now to the eastern edges of Europe, to the lands of Wallachia, where the figure of Vlad III, often called Vlad the Impaler, cast a long and fearful shadow over history. His reputation is one of cruelty, and later ages turned his story into legend. Yet in this softened telling, we do not linger upon those darker images. Instead, imagine Vlad not as a terror, but as a man seated in a quiet chamber. A candle burns on the table beside him, its flame bending in the draught. The room smells of wax, parchment, and the faint smoke of the hearth. Outside, the Carpathian forests breathe with silence, the wind moving gently among the pines. Vlad leans forward over a scroll, his hand steady as he writes, the scratch of the quill the only sound. In this softened vision, the infamous ruler becomes a solitary scholar at work, his heart calmed by the order of words upon a page, by the rhythm of thought made visible in ink. From Wallachia we may turn back toward France, to the reign of Philip IV, sometimes called Philip the Fair. His reign in the early 14th century was marked by disputes with the papacy and the suppression of the Knights Templar. Chroniclers judged him cold and calculating. Yet let us imagine another side. Philip, seated in the gardens of Fontainebleau, the air filled with the rustle of leaves and the song of birds. He leans back upon a stone bench, his crown set aside, his eyes following the flight of swallows across the sky. For a moment, the weight of rule lifts, and he is simply a man at ease in the quiet of nature. The gardens bloom around him, the sunlight dappling the paths, and the harshness of his name dissolves into tranquility. Now let us cross once again to England, to Henry VI. His reign in the 15th century was marred by weakness and civil strife, remembered in history as a time of turbulence. Yet Henry himself was a man of gentle disposition, more suited to contemplation than conflict. Imagine him in a chapel at Windsor, kneeling in prayer as light filters through stained glass. The colors fall upon his face, reds, blues, and golds mingling softly. The hush of the chapel enfolds him, the chants of monks rising faintly in the distance. In this softened scene, Henry is not the ineffectual king of chronicles, but a soul, at peace in devotion, seeking solace beyond the burdens of kingship. And from England we may wander to the Holy Roman Empire, to the figure of Wenceslas, son of Charles IV. His reign in the late 14th century was judged harshly for his neglect of imperial duties and his fondness for ease. Yet, in the calm of night, this fondness becomes not fault but blessing. Picture Wenceslas reclining in a shaded garden, the air filled with the scent of herbs. He sips from a cup of spiced wine, listening to the soft trickle of a fountain. The world beyond may demand governance, but in this moment he is content, his mind lulled by the hum of bees and the rustle of wind in branches. The thread that weaves through all these stories is not cruelty or failure, but humanity. Beneath the crowns, beneath the judgments of history, they were men who walked through gardens, who sat at tables, who listened to music and found comfort in quiet places. Let us now imagine Louis II of Hungary, whose reign ended in the disaster of Mohacs in 1526. Chroniclers recorded his youth, his inexperience, his downfall. Yet here we may soften the story. Picture Louis in the moments before dawn, seated at the edge of a meadow near Buda. Mist drifts low across the grass, and the dew glistens upon every blade. Birds stir in the hedges, their songs rising gently with the light. Louis draws his cloak tighter, breathing in the cool air, watching as the first rays of sun spill across the horizon. His crown may be heavy, his kingdom threatened, but here in the hush of morning he is simply a young man greeting the day-dot from Hungary. Let us drift north again, to Norway, and to Magnus IV, remembered as Magnus the Blind. His reign in the 12th century was troubled, yet the softened telling allows us to imagine him in peace. Picture Magnus seated by the shore, the sea stretching wide before him. The tide moves gently, shells glisten in the sand, and gulls circle lazily above. He listens to the waves, steady and eternal, and in their rhythm he finds a sense of calm that transcends the troubles of rule. As we drift among these rulers, we may pause to notice the settings around them, the castles, the gardens, the chapels, the forests. Each place was filled with its own sounds, its own scents, its own textures of daily life. Castles smelled of wood smoke and stone, of rushes laid upon the floor, of candles burning in iron sconces. Gardens offered the fragrance of roses, lavender, and mint, carried on the breeze. Chapels echoed with chants, the sound rising like mist into vaulted arches. Forests whispered with wind, the crackle of twigs beneath boots, the murmur of streams winding through moss. These were the true companions of kings, the background against which their reigns unfolded. Consider also Sigismund of Poland, sometimes judged harshly for indecision. Imagine him walking along the banks of the Vistula at sunset, his cloak trailing upon the earth. The river reflects the crimson sky, and fishermen draw in their nets, their voices carried softly across the water. Sigismund pauses to watch, his heart eased by the simplicity of the scene. His indecision matters little here, for the river flows on, eternal and untroubled. Or let us picture Charles II of Spain, remembered for frailty and the end of his dynasty. Yet even his story, softened, holds gentleness. Imagine Charles seated in a quiet chamber, a spaniel curled at his feet. He strokes the dog's fur slowly, listening to its steady breathing. Outside, bells toll the hour, their sound deep and reassuring. Whatever storms of politics swirled beyond, in this moment he is calm, soothed by the warmth of a faithful companion. And so, as we walk further into the night, we see again and again that the word terrible is not the whole truth. History may record failures and cruelties, but when softened for sleep, we glimpse another truth, that each of these rulers was bound by the same needs as all people for rest, for companionship, for the comfort of quiet moments. Imagine with me now the silence of a medieval cloister. The moonlight falls across stone. The air is cool and still. In the shadowed walkways, the kings of history appear, one by one. They do not wear crowns here, nor do they carry scepters. They are simply men, moving slowly, their steps echoing softly. Some pause to listen to the fountain, others to look up at the stars. Their eyes grow heavy, their shoulders relax, and at last they sit upon the stone benches, leaning back, closing their eyes. And so, one by one, they find rest. The long corridors of history remain hushed, their arches dimly lit by flickering lanterns. We move quietly forward, as though through a cloistered passage, and each step carries us deeper into the softened glow of memory. The figures who await us are remembered harshly by chroniclers, yet here, in the gentler telling, their stories unfold like candlelight upon steady, calming. Let us begin with Charles I of Naples. Called Charles of Anjou, in the 13th century he ruled with ambition, expanding his domains, often remembered as ruthless in his pursuits. Yet even for such a man, there were moments of stillness. Imagine him aboard a ship at anchor off the coast of Sicily, the waves rocking gently beneath. The crew sleeps upon the deck, the sails furled. Charles stands at the rail, gazing out at the horizon where the sea meets the sky. Stars shine above, endless and serene. The murmur of the tide soothes him, and for a time the weight of conquests fades. Here, on the deck in the quiet of night, he is no longer a conqueror, but simply a man lulled by the rhythm of water against wood. From Naples let us drift north once more, to France, to Charles VII, remembered as weak in his early years, overshadowed by the turmoil of the 100 Years' War, and yet, softened through time, his story carries moments of quiet grace. Imagine Charles seated in the gardens of Chinon, listening to the distant sound of bells. Bees hover above lavender, their steady hum joining the chorus of summer. His eyes rest upon the river below, its waters reflecting the slow drift of clouds. In this softened moment, Charles is not a hesitant king, but a quiet soul at rest in the rhythms of nature. Across the Channel, England too offers more figures whose reigns were troubled. Edward II comes to mind, a king remembered for misrule, for weakness, for dependence upon favorites. Yet beyond such judgments lies the humanity of a man who lived within stone walls and sought solace where he could find it. Picture Edward in the great hall of Kenilworth Castle, seated near the hearth as the flames crackle softly. The rushes on the floor carried the scent of herbs, rosemary and thyme scattered to freshen the air. Dogs lie curled nearby, their tails flicking as they dream. Edward holds a cup of spiced wine in his hands, warming them against the chill. His gaze is distant, his thoughts heavy, but the fire soothes him. In this moment, his failures dissolved, and only the calm of firelight remains. We may linger with another English king, Richard II, remembered for arrogance and downfall. Yet even Richard's story, softened, carries gentleness. Imagine him in the gardens of Eltham Palace, beneath blossoming trees. The petals fall like snow, drifting down upon his cloak. He tilts his head back to watch the branches swaying, the sky visible in fragments through the leaves. Children play in the distance, their laughter carried on the breeze. Richard closes his eyes, breathing in the fragrance of spring. Whatever pride or misjudgment history records, here he is, simply a man among blossoms, calmed by the turning of seasons. From England, let us wander east once more, to Poland, to the figure of Bolesław II, remembered harshly for the turmoil of his reign. Yet picture him in Krakow at dusk, standing at the window of Wall Castle. The city below glows with lanterns, the marketplace quieting after the day's bustle. The smell of bread and smoke lingers in the air. The Vistula flows steadily beyond, its surface glimmering with the reflection of torches along the shore. Bolesław rests his hands upon the stone sill, listening to the faint sounds of the city settling into night. His name may be shadowed by reproach, yet in this softened vision he is simply a man gazing upon his city with weary affection. Now let us turn to the Balkans, to Serbia, where King Uroš V, called Uroš the Weak, ruled in the 14th century. Chroniclers marked his reign as one of decline, his epithet a reminder of perceived frailty. But in the hush of night, the word weak takes on another meaning, gentle, reflective, unassuming. Picture Uroš in the monastery of Studenica, the frescoes glowing faintly by candlelight. Monks chant softly, their voices blending into harmony. Uroš kneels, his hands folded, his head bowed. The world outside may crumble, but within these walls there is peace. His reign may have been judged poorly, but here, in prayer, he is at rest. From Serbia, we may return again to France, to Louis XI, remembered as the universal spider, weaving webs of intrigue. Chroniclers saw cunning and manipulation, yet in softened vision, we see another scene. Imagine Louis walking in the gardens of Plessis-les-Tours, the morning mist clinging to the grass. He bends to pluck a rose, examining its delicate petals. The thorns prick his fingers, but he does not mind. He lifts the rose to his face, inhaling its fragrance deeply. For a moment, schemes and politics are forgotten. Only the beauty of a single flower remains. Beyond France, let us pause in Scotland once more, where Robert III reigned. His rule was marked by weakness, his health failing, his influence limited. Yet picture Robert seated in a chair beside the hearth at Rothsey Castle. His cloak is drawn about him, the fire warming his frail frame. Outside, the wind rattles shutters, carrying the salt smell of the sea. A servant places a blanket across his knees, and Robert nods gratefully, closing his eyes. His reign may have been judged as faltering, but in this softened vision, he is a man finding comfort in warmth and care. The theme becomes clearer with each story. What history has painted in dark colors, weakness, cruelty, folly softens here into the textures of ordinary life. A candle burning in a chamber, a rose plucked in the garden, a dog asleep by the hearth. These are the threads that weave humanity through the crown. Consider Ladislas of Naples, remembered for idleness and neglect. Imagine him reclining beneath an arbor heavy with vines, the dappled light of afternoon playing across his face. He sips from a cup of cool water, watching as birds dart among the leaves. Time drifts slowly, the heat of day softened by shade. Ladislas is not idle here, but contemplative, resting in the rhythm of nature. Consider Sigurd the Crusader of Norway, remembered for bold ventures abroad but also for restless years. Imagine him upon a quiet fjord at sunset, the boat rocking gently as oars rest. The water reflects the crimson sky, and mountains rise dark against the horizon. Sigurd closes his eyes, breathing deeply of the cold air, lulled by the lap of waves. In this moment, he is at peace. The tumult of campaigns far behind him. The hours pass, and the kings we meet in memory grow ever more softened, their flaws dissolved into gentleness. They become companions in reflection, shadows among cloisters, wanderers in gardens, dreamers before the fire. Picture now a great medieval banquet hall, long emptied after a feast. The tables are bare, the rushes scattered, the fires burned down to embers. The silence is deep, broken only by the faint crackle of ash. One by one, the kings of history enter, not in splendor, but in simplicity. They remove their crowns, lay aside their cloaks, and sit at the long wooden tables. They do not speak, they only rest, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight lift from their shoulders, and we, too, sit among them, part of the silence, part of the stillness. History, once harsh, is softened into a lullaby, guiding us gently deeper into rest. The halls of memory remain dim and gentle, their stones cool beneath the touch, their arches echoing only the sound of distant footsteps. We walk softly onward, carrying with us the softened images of kings whose names were once marked by harsh words, yet who now linger only as quiet figures, softened into stillness. Let us turn now to Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, remembered for a troubled reign in the late 14th century. Chroniclers called him indolent, distracted, prone to negligence in times when his kingdom required strength. But in the softened vision of memory, these faults drift into gentleness. Picture him sitting beneath the trees near Prague Castle, a book open upon his lap. The sunlight filters through leaves, dappling the page. His dog lies curled beside him, ears twitching in dream. Wenceslas leans back, closing his eyes as a breeze stirs the grass. In this softened image, he is no longer a king weighed down by judgment, but simply a man at rest, listening to the quiet rustle of branches, not far away. In Hungary, we find Louis II, whose short reign ended at the tragic Battle of Mohacs. His youth and inexperience marked him as vulnerable, remembered as ill, but picture him in the palace at Buda, walking slowly along the terraces at dawn. The Danube glimmers below, carrying with it the reflection of the rising sun. He lingers by the balustrade, watching the water flow steadily, endlessly, past the city he loves. Birds sweep overhead, their wings flashing against the light. In this softened moment, Louis is not a doomed monarch, but a contemplative soul, standing before the eternal river. Let us wander westward once more, into Castile, to Henry IV, sometimes called the Impotent, remembered harshly for weakness and discord during his reign. But such judgments fade when we picture him in a quiet courtyard at Segovia, the fountain trickling steadily. Orange trees line the walls, their blossoms filling the air with fragrance. Henry sits upon a stone bench, listening to the water's song. The disputes of his court are far away. Here there is only the sound of flowing water and the peace of solitude. From Spain we drift northward to Denmark, to Christian II, remembered for cruelty and missteps, his name forever tied to the Stockholm bloodbath. Yet even such a figure, when seen through softened light, holds moments of quiet. Imagine him walking along the shoreline, the Baltic stretching out before him in endless blue. Waves lap gently at the sand, gulls cry faintly above. He stoops to pick up a shell, turning it in his fingers, marveling at its delicate spirals. The sea air fills his lungs, and for a time he feels no crown, no burden, only the vast, calming presence of the sea. And now let us return to England once more, where John, often called Lackland, remains one of the most maligned kings in memory. Chroniclers marked him with cruelty and failure, and yet, even for John, there were quiet moments. Picture him within the cloisters of a monastery, walking slowly beneath the arches as evening falls. The monks chant in the distance, their voices rising and falling like the tide. John pauses to touch the cold stone of a column, its surface worn smooth by generations. He breathes deeply of the cool evening air, his thoughts quiet. Here, the failings of rule fade away, leaving only a man wandering among the stones of faith. Beyond John, we might linger with Stephen of England, whose reign was marked by civil war and discord. Yet picture him in the countryside, riding slowly through fields golden with grain. The breeze stirs the stalks, creating a ripple like waves upon the sea. Stephen halts his horse and listens, the sound of rustling grain calming his troubled heart. He dismounts, walking into the field, running his hands through the tall stalks. The scent of earth, the warmth of the sun, the steady hum of bees all soothe him. For a moment, he is no longer a king embattled, but a man cradled in the embrace of the land. From England, we travel once more to the Low Countries, to John II of Brabant, remembered as ineffective, overshadowed by his struggles. But picture him standing in the market square of Brussels at twilight. Merchants shutter their stalls, children chase each other across the cobbles, lanterns are lit one by one. John stands quietly at the edge, watching the life of his people unfold. He feels the rhythm of the city, its ordinary pulse, its quiet continuity, and he smiles, content in the knowledge that life flows on, regardless of his troubles. From Brabant, we drift east to Byzantium once more, though centuries later than the splendor of Justinian and Theodora. Here we find Michael III, called the drunkard by his critics, remembered for negligence. But let us soften this image. Imagine him at a small harbor along the Bosporus, seated in a boat as it rocks gently at anchor. Fishermen mend their nets nearby, their voices low and steady. Michael gazes out across the waters, the current carrying ships toward the horizon. He leans back, closing his eyes, the motion of the boat soothing him into stillness. In this softened vision, he is not mocked but calmed, held by the embrace of the sea. Let us linger longer in Byzantium, with Constantine IX, another emperor judged harshly by chroniclers for indulgence and weakness. Yet picture him in the gardens of the palace, surrounded by roses in bloom. He walks slowly among them, touching petals with delicate care. The fragrance of the blossoms surrounds him, the sunlight warm upon his shoulders. A fountain murmurs nearby, and doves coo softly in the trees. Whatever history may record, here Constantine is simply a man among flowers, content in the beauty of his garden. The softened rhythm continues, each king once called terrible now resting quietly in gentler visions. These figures, removed from the harsh strokes of chroniclers, dissolve into moments of humanity. They sit by fires, wander gardens, gaze upon rivers, listen to the wind in the trees. Consider Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, remembered by some as ineffective despite his long reign. Picture him in his library at Prague, seated before a desk strewn with manuscripts. Candles glow softly, casting golden halos upon the parchment. Charles dips his pen, pausing not to write, but simply to listen. The silence of the library is deep, interrupted only by the faint scratch of quills from distant scribes. Charles closes his eyes, breathing in the scent of vellum and wax. Here, he is not judged, but simply at peace amid the written word. Or let us linger with Sigismund of Hungary and Bohemia, criticized for vanity and missteps. Yet picture him standing at a balcony in Constance, watching the sun sink behind the lake. The water glows with orange and gold, the air cool upon his face. He rests his hands upon the stone rail, feeling its solidity. The disputes and counsels of his reign fade into quiet. In this softened vision, only the beauty of a sunset remains. The softened tapestry grows richer as we wander from land to land. Each king once named terrible becomes instead a figure of gentleness, seeking rest in gardens, libraries, or the calm embrace of nature. It is as though the crown, heavy in life, has been set aside in memory, leaving only the simple humanity beneath. Now imagine a vast medieval cathedral at night. The nave stretches into shadow, the air cool and still. Candles flicker before the altar, their light trembling against carved stone. One by one, kings enter the space, no longer clad in robes or crowns, but in plain garments. They walk slowly down the aisle, their footsteps echoing softly. They sit upon the benches, heads bowed, hands folded. No words are spoken, no judgments cast. Only silence fills the space, vast and calming. And in that silence, history itself seems to rest. The harshness of chronicles fades, the judgments dissolve. All that remains is stillness, the deep and gentle stillness that carries us further into the night. The corridors of time remain hushed, their shadows long, their air heavy with the perfume of old stone and faded banners. We move softly, as though drifting through a cloister after the bells have rung for evening prayers. The kings who await us are remembered in history with stern words. Yet here they come, not as tyrants or fools, but as quiet figures, softened by candlelight and silence. Let us turn first to Charles VI of France. Known to history as Charles the Mad, his reign was darkened by episodes of instability, by war and division. Yet, even for such a figure, there were gentle moments. Imagine Charles walking through a forest in autumn. The leaves fall in golden cascades, the path carpeted in rust and amber. He carries a small branch in his hand, brushing it gently against the ground as he walks. The air is cool and fragrant with earth. For a time, his thoughts are quiet. The forest receives him not as a king or a troubled man, but simply as another soul beneath its canopy. From France, we drift once more to England, where Henry VI reigned. Chroniclers spoke of weakness, of fragility, of a man unsuited to the crown. But picture Henry seated in a chapel, the light of stained glass falling across his face in hues of sapphire and crimson. He holds a prayer book upon his knees, though he does not read. Instead, he listens to the faint crackle of candles, to the silence that fills the vaulted space. His heart is calm, his breathing slow. Here, beyond judgment, Henry is a figure of gentleness, at peace in prayer. Let us move northward to Scotland, to James III, remembered for neglect and discord. Yet imagine him in the stillness of a winter's evening. Snow has fallen, covering the fields and forests around Edinburgh. James stands at the window of his chamber, watching as flakes drift past the glass. The fire behind him glows softly, warming the air. The snow muffles every sound, creating a silence so deep it seems almost sacred. James rests his hand upon the cold stone sill, exhaling slowly. The burdens of rule fall away. He is simply a man watching snow fall upon the quiet world. Further east, in Hungary, Matthias II reigned amid difficulties, often overshadowed and criticized. But picture him at the banks of the Danube, a fishing rod in his hand, the water calm before him. The sun sets slowly, painting the sky with hues of violet and rose. The river reflects the colors, shimmering with gentle light. Matthias sits upon a wooden stool, his cloak pulled close against the evening chill. He does not mind whether the fish bite. It is enough simply to sit, to watch the river flow, to be held in the quiet of twilight. Now let us pause in Naples once more, with Ferdinand I, whose reign was troubled by conflicts and harsh judgments. Yet even Ferdinand, when seen through softened memory, finds moments of peace. Imagine him in a vineyard at harvest time. The air is heavy with the scent of ripe grapes, the vines stretching in rows across the hillside. Workers sing softly as they gather the fruit, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of labor. Ferdinand walks slowly among them, trailing his fingers along the leaves. The sun warms his face, the scent of the earth steadies his heart. In this softened vision, he is not a ruler judged, but a man among vines, calmed by the abundance of the land. Across the Mediterranean, in the Byzantine world, Andronikos I Komnenos is remembered harshly, chronicled as a cruel and vengeful emperor. But even such a man, when softened through time, reveals quiet moments. Picture him seated upon a terrace overlooking the Bosporus at dawn. The waters shimmer with pale light, ships drifting like shadows across the current. Andronikos rests his chin upon his hand, watching the horizon brighten. The cries of seabirds fill the air, mingling with the whisper of waves against stone. Whatever judgments history has cast, here he is only a figure watching the day's first light, softened by the endless sea dot from Byzantium. Let us turn north to Muscovy, where Ivan IV, remembered as the terrible, casts a long shadow in history. Yet even Ivan, whose name evokes fear, may be softened in this vision. Imagine him within a wooden church in the Russian winter. The logs crackle in the fire. The icons glimmer with candlelight. Outside, the wind howls through the snow. But within, there is warmth and stillness. Ivan kneels, his fur cloak spread across the floor, his forehead resting against the cool wood. In this softened vision, he is not terrible, but small, quiet, a man at prayer surrounded by silence. We may move west again, to Germany, where Ludwig II of Bavaria, centuries later, was called eccentric, a dreamer king. Though not medieval, his spirit lingers in this softened company of kings. Picture him wandering through the halls of Neuschwanstein at night, the moonlight streaming through tall windows. He moves slowly, touching the stone, listening to the echo of his own footsteps. His imagination fills the silence, but here it is, gentle, calm. He pauses at a window, gazing upon the mountains veiled in mist. Whatever history has said, here Ludwig is simply a man wandering in dream. Let us wander back into France, where Philip III, called the Bold, carried the weight of wars and losses. Imagine him pausing in a cloister garden at dusk. Lanterns glow softly along the walls, the air cool and scented with herbs. Philip sits upon a stone bench, listening to the evening birds. He clasps his hands in his lap, leaning forward slightly. His gaze is distant, thoughtful. In this softened image, no battle or judgment remains, only a man breathing in the stillness of twilight. From France we drift toward Portugal, to Afonso V, remembered for his restless ventures and failures. Yet imagine him along the coast, seated upon a rock, while the tide laps gently at his feet. He gazes at the horizon, where the sun sinks into the Atlantic. The air smells of salt and kelp. The sky blazes with color. Afonso rests his chin upon his knees, lost in thought. The sea stretches endlessly, and in its vastness he finds quiet. Whatever ambition or misstep history remembers, here he is simply a man gazing at the eternal sea. From Portugal we may drift further west in thought, to the kingdoms of Aragon and Navarre, where Sancho IV ruled. Chroniclers painted him as harsh, as flawed, but softened here. He becomes gentle. Imagine Sancho standing among olive groves at harvest, the air fragrant with oil and earth. Workers laugh softly, children run between the trees. Sancho bends to pick an olive from the ground, rolling it in his fingers before setting it back gently upon the soil. He lifts his gaze to the hills beyond, softened by the haze of evening. The land itself seems to cradle him, forgiving and calm. The rhythm of these softened visions becomes like a lullaby, steady and unbroken. Kings once judged harshly dissolve into quiet humanity. Men at riversides, men before fires, men among gardens and cloisters. Their crowns vanish, their burdens lift, and only silence remains. Picture now a medieval inn at the edge of a forest. The day's travelers have gone to sleep. The hearth glows with the last embers. In the great room, benches line the walls, their wood worn smooth. And in this room, one by one, kings gather, not in splendor, but in simplicity. They lay aside their swords, their robes, their crowns. They sit together upon the benches, their eyes half closed, their breaths deep and even. The air is warm, the silence soothing. They do not speak. They simply rest, as men who have walked long roads at last finding shelter. And in their rest, we too are invited to sit among them, to share in the silence, to let the long centuries drift past like smoke from the embers. Harsh history fades, leaving only the calm glow of memory, soft and endless. The path of history stretches onward, dimly lit, soft as though wrapped in mist. We walk slowly along it, our steps light, our breaths steady, the air filled with the scent of old wood and stone. The kings who await us are figures painted harshly by chroniclers, but here they appear in softened vision, clothed not in judgment but in quiet humanity. Let us first turn to Alfonso XI of Castile, remembered for both triumph and cruelty, a ruler of contrasts. In the softened light of memory, however, we see not the warrior, not the stern judge, but a man at rest. Picture him in a courtyard at Seville, a fountain murmuring in the center. The night air is warm, filled with the fragrance of jasmine. Alfonso sits in a chair, his hands folded upon his knees. The sound of water soothes him, its rhythm blending with the hum of insects in the dark. Above him the stars shine steadily, timeless and gentle. Whatever harshness history may remember, here Alfonso is calmed by the quiet song of water. From Spain, let us wander north to Denmark once more. where Eric of Pomerania ruled. His reign was troubled, his legacy criticized, yet even Eric knew the softness of evening. Imagine him upon a ship anchored near Copenhagen, the sea calm around him. Lanterns swing gently, their light glowing against the sails. Eric leans upon the railing, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. The air carries the faint sound of waves against wood, steady and lulling. For a time, his thoughts drift like the tide, and in this softened moment, he is simply a man soothed by the sea. Far to the east, in Poland, Casimir IV is remembered as flawed by some chroniclers, his long rule marked by disputes. But picture him walking through a meadow at dawn. The dew lies heavy upon the grass, sparkling faintly in the rising sun. Birds lift their voices in chorus, filling the air with gentle song. Casimir walks slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. His gaze rests upon the horizon where the light brightens steadily. Here, he is not a king weighed by politics, but a solitary figure at peace in nature's embrace. Now let us drift south into Italy, to Manfred of Sicily, remembered for his ill-fated rule and the shadow of conflict that followed him. Yet softened, he becomes a figure of quiet contemplation. Imagine him at dusk upon a hillside, gazing down at olive groves bathed in golden light. The wind carries the faint scent of earth and oil, the sound of cicadas filling the air. Manfred sits upon a stone, resting his chin upon his hands. His eyes followed the flight of swallows across the sky. In this softened vision, no doom remains, only a man watching the day surrender to night. We may pause in Burgundy with Charles the Bold, whose ambition led him into ruin. Yet picture Charles in a quiet garden at Ghent. The roses bloom, the bees hum, the air is warm with summer. He leans upon a stone balustrade, plucking a single blossom to hold between his fingers. He examines its petals, soft and fragrant, before setting it gently into the fountain beside him. His eyes follow the petals as they drift upon the water's surface. In this softened vision, he is not bold, nor reckless, but quiet, reflective, stilled by beauty. From Burgundy let us turn back toward England once more, to Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king, remembered for the tragedy of Hastings. Yet imagine Harold, not in battle, but upon a quiet morning walk along the coast of Sussex. The tide has receded, leaving wet sand gleaming in the pale light. Harold walks barefoot, the cool water lapping at his ankles. The gulls cry faintly. The horizon stretches endlessly before him. His steps leave prints in the sand, soon to be washed away. Whatever fate awaited him, here he is simply a man walking by the sea, calmed by the rhythm of waves. Further north, in Norway, Magnus IV is remembered for instability, a reign clouded by conflict. But picture Magnus seated in a wooden hall, the fire burning low in the hearth. Snow falls outside, blanketing the land in silence. Within, the warmth of the flames glows against carved timbers. Magnus sits wrapped in a fur cloak, his gaze fixed upon the fire. His hands rest upon his knees, his breath steady. The world outside may be harsh, but within these walls there is calm. The snow muffles every sound, and Magnus, for a time, knows only quiet. Let us linger now in France, with Louis X, remembered as weak and troubled. Imagine Louis seated in a cloister, the arches framing a garden where herbs grow. Bees drift lazily among blossoms. Monks walk slowly, their hands clasped in prayer. Louis sits upon a bench, his head bowed, listening to the hum of insects and the distant toll of a bell. The sun warms the stones, the fragrance of mint and sage fills the air. In this softened vision, no weakness remains, only stillness, only rest. From France we drift eastward, to Hungary again, to Charles I, whose reign was marked by unrest. Picture him at nightfall, seated beside a river. The stars glimmer above, the water reflects their light like scattered jewels. Charles listens to the gentle murmur of the current, its steady flow carrying his thoughts with it. He leans back upon the grass, gazing upward into the endless sky. In this softened image, he is not burdened by rule, but part of the vast, calming night. Across the continent, in Aragon, Martin I is remembered as a king of little strength, his reign brief and overshadowed. Yet softened, he becomes a figure of quiet humanity. Imagine him in a small chapel, the candles burning low. The scent of wax and incense lingers in the air. Martin kneels, his hands clasped, his head bowed. His lips move silently in prayer, though no sound escapes. The silence deepens, enfolding him. In this softened moment, he is no longer king, but simply a soul at rest. The rhythm of these softened portraits continues, like waves upon a shore. Each king once called terrible, or weak, or cruel, dissolves into a figure at peace walking through forests, resting by rivers, kneeling in chapels. Their crowns are set aside, their burdens forgotten, leaving only quiet humanity. Imagine now a great medieval library, its shelves lined with heavy volumes, its air scented with parchment and ink. The room is lit only by a few candles, their flames trembling softly. One by one, kings enter the library, their footsteps muffled upon the stone floor. They move among the shelves, running their hands along the spines of books. Some sit at tables, opening manuscripts, though they do not read. Others stand by windows, gazing out into the night. No words are spoken. The silence is deep, filled only with the sound of pages turning. And in this silence, history itself seems to rest. The judgments of chroniclers fade like echoes. The harsh names, mad, cruel, weak, terrible, dissolve into the calm hush of memory. All that remains is the gentle rhythm of kings at rest, their humanity revealed in stillness. And as we walk among them, we too are drawn deeper into the quiet, lulled by the endless softening of time. The night deepens, and still the corridors of history stretch before us, long and dim, their arches echoing with footsteps long faded. The kings we pass now are softened by time, their harshness dissolved into the mist of memory. No longer rulers, no longer figures of fear, they are shadows and silhouettes, gentle to the eye, quiet to the mind. Let us pause with Henry IV of England, once troubled, once remembered with unease, yet softened by the calm of centuries. He becomes a man at rest. Imagine him beneath an old oak tree, its branches spreading wide, casting shade upon the grass. The air is warm, and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze fills the silence. Henry lies upon the earth, his eyes closed, his hands folded upon his chest. Sunlight dapples across his face. A bird sings somewhere in the branches above. In this softened moment, he is not weighed by plots or illness, but simply resting in the comfort of nature's stillness. From England, let us move to Bohemia, to Wenceslas IV, remembered as an ineffective ruler, a figure mocked by chroniclers, but picture him instead in a vineyard at harvest. The vines hang heavy with grapes, their skins dark and shining in the autumn light. Wenceslas lifts a cluster, turning it gently in his hand before pressing it to his lips. The taste is sweet, the juice cool upon his tongue. Around him, workers laugh softly, filling baskets, their movements steady and rhythmic. The air is fragrant with ripening fruit. In this softened vision, he is not inept, but calm, a man tasting sweetness in the quiet countryside. From Bohemia we travel to Naples, where Joanna II reigned. Though remembered with unease, her figure softens in twilight. Picture her in a chamber hung with silk draperies, a harp resting near the window. She moves her fingers gently along the strings, drawing forth a quiet melody. The notes linger in the air like whispers, delicate and faint. Outside, the city rests, its streets hushed beneath the stars. Joanna closes her eyes, her hands moving slowly, her breathing steady with the rhythm of the song. Here, no intrigue remains, only music, only peace. Now, let us wander to Germany, to Ludwig II of Bavaria, called eccentric, remembered for castles and solitude, yet softened. His image glows serene. Imagine him at twilight, walking alone along the shores of a still lake. The water reflects the fading colors of the sky rose, gold, indigo. Swans drift across the surface, their wings glimmering faintly. Ludwig pauses at the water's edge, his reflection shimmering beneath him. He kneels, touching the surface lightly with his fingertips, watching the ripples spread outward in perfect circles. In this softened vision, his solitude is no curse, but a gift. The lake itself, a mirror of his inward peace. Further east, we may pause with Władyslas II of Hungary and Bohemia, remembered as weak, but softened by quiet memory. Picture him in a cloister garden, seated upon a stone bench, the air filled with the scent of lavender. Monks pass by slowly, their sandals brushing softly against the stones. Władyslas sits with a book upon his lap, though he does not read. Instead, he watches a butterfly drift lazily among the flowers, its wings open and close in delicate rhythm, light as air. In this softened vision, he is no weak king, but simply a man captivated by a fleeting moment of beauty. The night carries us northward to Sweden, where Magnus Eriksson ruled, remembered for his struggles. But picture Magnus in a forest clearing, the pines standing tall, their scent fresh in the air. He kneels beside a stream, cupping water in his hands. The coolness refreshes him. The sound of the current soothes. He gazes at the reflection of the trees swaying above, the sky visible between their branches. The world seems vast, and he small within it, yet the vastness comforts him, and in this softened vision, he is calmed by the endless patience of the forest. From Sweden we drift to France once again, to Philip III, remembered without great strength or distinction, yet picture him seated in a great cathedral, the candles flickering, the vast vaults rising above. The choir sings softly, their voices blending into harmony that seems to float upon the very air. Philip closes his eyes, his hands resting upon the wooden pew before him. The music fills him, the stone around him resonating with sound. Here, no judgments remain, only song, only peace. Across the Alps, in Savoy, Amadeus VIII is remembered as strange, for resigning his throne and seeking solitude. Yet softened, he becomes a figure of gentle rest. Imagine him in a mountain retreat, the snow stretching white and unbroken across the slopes. He sits before a window, watching the snow fall softly from a sky the color of pearl. The world outside is silent, muffled by winter's blanket. A fire burns quietly beside him, its warmth steady. Amadeus holds a cup of warm wine, sipping slowly, each taste grounding him in calm. In this softened moment, he is at peace, wrapped in the embrace of silence. Let us linger now in Portugal, with Afonso V, remembered as indecisive. Yet imagine him walking at dawn along the walls of Lisbon. The city lies still, its streets empty, the river gleaming faintly with the reflection of morning light. Afonso rests his hands upon the stone, breathing in the cool air. A ship moved slowly upon the water, its sails catching the first rays of the sun. In this softened vision, indecision disappears, replaced by stillness, by the quiet beauty of a waking city. From Portugal we drift to Naples once again, to Ferdinand I, remembered as harsh, yet softened. He becomes gentle in memory. Picture him in an orchard, the branches heavy with lemons and oranges. He plucks one fruit, cutting it open with a small knife. The scent is bright, the juice glistens in the sun. He tastes it slowly, savoring its sharp sweetness. The orchard hums with bees, the air is golden with light. In this softened vision, Ferdinand is not harsh, but content, a man enjoying the simple abundance of the earth. The night carries us on, across rivers and fields, through forests and valleys, past the great shadows of castles and the glowing windows of chapels. Each king once burdened by judgment becomes lighter, softened, rendered human by time. Their crowns are set aside, their names gentled by the hush of centuries. Imagine now that we enter a vast medieval hall, its ceiling supported by heavy beams, its floor of stone worn smooth by countless feet. Along the walls hang faded tapestries, their colors muted but still soft with pattern. The hall is quiet, lit only by torches that glow gently, their flames swaying like reeds in a breeze. One by one, kings step into the hall, their movements slow, their faces serene. They take their seats upon benches, not as rulers, but as men. They do not speak, but their presence fills the air like a calm tide. In this softened gathering, all judgments dissolve. What remains is stillness, shared humanity, and the endless lull of time itself. The hall of memory grows quiet now, as though all its shadows have settled into their places, as though the long procession of kings has come at last to rest. Yet before we close this slow and gentle journey, let us linger a little longer among the figures who still drift at the edges of history, softened by time, hushed by centuries. In the lowlands of Europe, we may pause with Charles II of Navarre, sometimes remembered with suspicion, his name clouded by distrust. But let us not dwell upon such things. Instead, imagine him walking through a meadow in springtime, where wildflowers scatter across the grass like fallen stars. The air is sweet with blossoms, the sky soft with drifting clouds. He bends to pluck a single flower, holding it lightly between his fingers, watching its petals tremble in the breeze. For this moment, there is no scheme, no rivalry, no fear, only the quiet presence of a man in a field, touched by the gentleness of the earth. From Navarre, let us drift to Scotland, where James II once reigned, remembered for fierce tempers and troubled years, yet in memory's softer vision, he appears differently. Picture him standing upon a rocky shore at dawn. The sea stretches wide, its surface shimmering as the first light of day brushes against it. Waves roll gently toward the land, their sound steady and calming, like the heartbeat of the world itself. James stands still, breathing in the salt air, his cloak lifting in the breeze. The horizon glows with pale light, and in that glow, he is calmed, his presence absorbed into the endless rhythm of the sea. Further east, in Poland, there was Bolesław II, remembered with unease for harsh actions, yet softened now. Imagine him in a small wooden chapel, its beams dark with age, its candles flickering faintly. The sound of distant bells drifts across the air, slow and steady, like the breathing of time. He kneels upon the worn stone floor, not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a man seeking stillness. His hands are folded, his eyes closed, and in the quiet, there is no judgment, only the silence of a sacred place, a silence that lulls the heart into peace. In Denmark, we may pause with Christian II, called cruel in his time, yet softened now by history's haze. Imagine him on a winter evening, walking through a courtyard where snow has begun to fall. The flakes drift gently downward, touching his cloak, melting upon his skin. Lanterns glow softly along the walls, their light diffused by the falling snow. The air is hushed, the world quiet, each sound muffled by the whiteness that blankets the earth. He lifts his gaze to the sky, watching the endless dance of snowflakes, each unique, each fleeting. In that gaze, he is softened, and the night becomes his companion. Farther south, in Aragon, we encounter Peter IV, remembered as harsh and unbending. But in this softened vision, he is seated in a garden at dusk. The air is cool, scented with jasmine, and the sky glows faintly with fading light. A fountain murmurs softly nearby, its waters shimmering like liquid silver. Peter sits with his hands resting on his knees, listening to the sound of the water. The world beyond the garden fades, the cares of the throne vanish. All that remains is the fountain's voice, calm and eternal, soothing as the passage of years. In Burgundy, there was Charles the Bold, remembered for his fiery temper and restless ambition. Yet here, softened by time, he is simply a man standing in a vineyard at harvest. The air is filled with the scent of crushed grapes, rich and sweet. Workers move steadily through the vines, their laughter soft, their baskets heavy. Charles raises a cup of fresh wine, tasting its tart sweetness, closing his eyes as the flavor lingers upon his tongue. For this moment, there is no boldness, no ambition, only the earth's abundance, only the simplicity of a harvest well gathered. The journey carries us onward, through quiet lands and softened visions, until at last we come to Byzantium once more. Here, long ago, emperors ruled with heavy hands and turbulent hearts. Among them was Michael VIII Palaeologos, remembered with mixed voices, both praise and blame. Yet in this softened vision, he is seated in the gallery of Hagia Sophia. The great dome rises above him, vast and luminous, its mosaics gleaming faintly in the light of candles. Chant drifts upward, slow and resonant, filling the space with a sound like eternity. Michael rests his hands upon the stone before him, his eyes half closed, listening. In this place, no judgment, lingers only harmony, only stillness. Now imagine, if you will, that all these figures, kings of France and England, rulers of Germany, lords of Spain and Italy, sovereigns of Poland and Hungary, princes of Scandinavia and beyond, have gathered in one place, not in a throne room, not in a hall of power, but in a great meadow at twilight. The grass sways softly, touched by a breeze. The sky above is painted with hues of rose and violet, the first stars beginning to appear. The kings sit upon the ground, not upon thrones, not upon high seats, but simply upon the earth itself. Their crowns are set aside, their robes loosened. They sit together in silence, watching the sky darken, listening to the sounds of night as they rise, the chirp of crickets, the sigh of wind, the faint call of a night bird. In this vision, there is no memory of cruelty, no weight of failure, no burden of history. There is only quiet companionship, only the shared humanity of figures once distant, now softened and near. The meadow holds them gently, the twilight enfolds them, and the stars above shine steadily, patient and calm. As the night deepens, the kings close their eyes. One by one, their breathing slows, their bodies relax. They drift into stillness, into rest, into the quiet embrace of sleep. Around them, the meadow hums softly with life. The sky stretches infinite and serene. The earth itself cradles them with patience older than time. And so our journey to draw us to its close. We have wandered through centuries, moved softly across kingdoms and empires, paused with rulers once called terrible, once judged harshly. Yet in the slow and gentle telling, they have become something else. No longer kings, no longer tyrants, no longer names in chronicles, but softened figures, human and fragile, at rest within the quiet of memory. As you lie listening, let their stories dissolve into the hush of night. Let the images of candlelit halls, of gardens at dusk, of snowy courtyards and vineyards at harvest, fade slowly into the background of your mind. Let the rhythm of the words slow your breathing. Let the calm of history wrap around you like a blanket. The kings are gone now, their crowns set aside, their shadows fading into the mist. The night remains, deep and endless, waiting to carry you gently into sleep. Rest now, for the journey is complete. Rest, for the past has softened into silence. Rest, for history itself has become a lullaby.